The first core principle of economics that we did is people respond to incentives. Second one is that resources are scarce. Third one is that real values matter. Fourth foundation stone of the economics that we're going to be doing is that prices reflect scarcity. Why do relative prices change over time? That if you compare prices to each other from one year to the next or over longer periods, you will note that relative prices don't remain exactly the same. Some things become relatively more expensive, others become relatively cheaper. Why is that? Well, to answer that question, let's start by trying to understand and define a market. A market is a meeting of buyers and sellers. Any kind of meeting of buyers and sellers. That meeting can be in the same place. It can be a physical meeting of buyers and sellers. Like at an auction, all the buyers are there and they sit in front of somebody representing the seller, and that is how the sale transaction takes place. But some markets are virtual, that the buyer and seller are never in the same room, and yet buying and selling transactions can take place, for example, online. So markets can be physical or they can be virtual. Markets can all be in one place. The market has a location where all the buying and selling takes place. So for example, a stock market only takes place at the stock exchange. That can be physical, as in some markets that have not become yet electronic, or it can be virtual. It can be within a computer. But the point is there's only one location for that market. If markets are not concentrated, then they can be dispersed. The market for hamburgers takes place at many locations throughout the country. So the only thing that determines whether it's a market is whether buyers and sellers can effect their transaction. This principle is that prices rise and fall to reflect changes in relative scarcity of goods and services. When goods become relatively more scarce, that is to say, when more people desire to have it relative to the amount that's available, prices go up. Prices go up on their own, almost like an automatic force. And when those who desire to have it falls relative to the available supply, then prices tend to go down. This principle is so obvious that you didn't need to take a course in economics to know that this is true. This is one of those that we just absorb by, looking around us. So it's not difficult to convince you of that. When we talk about prices, we don't necessarily mean the sticker price. The price really is the agglomeration of whatever you have to give up in order to get it. So if you have to travel a distance to get it, or if you have to wait in a long line, that is part of what you have to give up in order to get the good. So when we talk about price, we're including that as well. And scarcity simply means the difference between the amount that people want to have and the amount that those who are supplying it wish to make available. Prices reflect relative scarcity. Examples of this are all around you. St. Catherine farmers experience oversupply of crops. Prices fall. Nobody reading this article is going to be puzzled about the connection between the part that says oversupply and the part that follows that says prices fall. Ecuador setbacks spell banana price rise. Poor weather affected the banana plantations and fewer bananas were produced. Prices of banana on the world market went up. Not difficult to find examples. But this idea that prices automatically move up and down to reflect relative scarcity, like all of the principles that we are discussing, is more powerful than it appears to be. I remember when Hurricane Gustav in 2008 knocked out the bridge between Harbor and east to St. Thomas. At a stroke, all of the residents east of that bridge were unable to transport themselves to Kingston and to the airport and to the entire western side. This was a resource, the ability to transport yourself, that was in abundant supply. And once a hurricane hit, it became scarce. You were not able to cross the river. A market emerged. The market that emerged, as anybody who lives in that side of the country might remember, is that suppliers showed up willing to take people across the flowing river on their backs. One of the great things about economics is that, and being an economist, is that you like to see it in action. And I myself, getting in my car and driving out to the Harborview Bridge so I could see this market emerge. Men were ferrying people across the river on their backs. It was $100 a crossing. If you had luggage, it's $200. If you were of ample weight, it was $200. Now, understand that this was automatic, It's not that the nearby residents, realizing that the bridge was out, made a phone call to the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management and said, the bridge is down, people need to cross, we need to do something. And the director of the emergency unit have to call a meeting and dispatch people and everybody agree on a price. No. Once the scarcity emerged, then a price to solve the scarcity problem arose. And the price motivated suppliers to supply the service. So it was price that solved that problem. Now, perhaps one or two of the young men might have gone there to help out their fellow citizens, but by and large, the many young men that showed up were there to earn the $100 that people were willing to pay to cross the river. Price rose because there was suddenly a scarcity. Appreciating the role of prices as a barometer of relative scarcity allows us to resolve an old-time teaching tool of economics called the diamond water paradox. And the paradox is that water, which is literally essential to life, that without water, you die within a few days. So everybody must have water, but it's cheap. Whereas diamonds, which is essential to nobody's life, one or two of you may disagree, but we can pretty much go through our entire lives without having a diamond. It's expensive. The thing that is necessary to life is cheap, and the thing that is optional and most people can and do without is expensive. It only appears to be a paradox because we're focusing on the desire side of scarcity, on how many people want it and need it. Once we realize that the issue here is scarcity, that we have to counter the supply side, then it resolves the paradox that water is necessary but abundant. It falls from the sky. And because it is relatively abundant, it ends up being cheap. Diamonds are scarce. They are scarce because they don't fall from the sky or pop out of the ground in every country. And so even though many fewer people want diamonds, that scarcity makes its price expensive. To understand prices, we simply need to recognize that they reflect relative scarcity. Having established the role of prices and what prices are doing in a market, there are some subtleties we need to be aware of. First, when we say prices reflect relative scarcity, we're talking about the real price, not the nominal price. Secondly, price changes to reflect changes in relative scarcity, but sometimes it may seem to anticipate or lag the event that makes it more or less scarce. It doesn't seem to move at the same time. Sometimes it looks like prices anticipate the scarcity event. Domestic problems in the Syrian economy threatens to reduce the world supply of oil in a few weeks or in a few months' time. Oil prices go up from now because people are anticipating that supply is going to be contracting because of a problem in one of the oil producing countries. Well, what is happening is that in anticipation of people having to pay more for oil next month, then people start to buy up oil from this month. And so the demand is rising from now. So the scarcity is actually taking place now, even though the thing, the actual event, which is going to trigger scarcity, is a month away. So in that case, it looks like the increase in price is anticipating the physical reduction in supply that people are worried about next month. Prices can also lag the event because some markets move slowly. You know, financial markets move very quickly, but like the foreign exchange market. But in some markets, for various structural reasons, price doesn't adjust instantly or even quickly. That you're actually going to have shortages emerging and persisting for a while before price gets a chance to adjust. One example of this is the market for labor, you know, wages and salaries. That nobody really negotiates their salary for the day every single morning. You agree on a salary, and that salary you agree on really covers at least a year in most formal settings. And even in informal settings, it may cover the week. So when there's a change in relative scarcity in the labor market, prices don't rise or fall. Salaries and wages don't rise and fall, the same day or even the same week. It takes months, and indeed for the whole labor market to reflect that change, wages and salaries might not adjust for years. Price movements can be disguised. You can't just look at the sticker price. One common way of disguising price movements is to offer more for the same sticker price. If you buy the product at the same price that you bought it at last week, you will get extra for free. You will get it bundled with something else. That is really a way of reducing the price. So price movements can be disguised. Price changes that reflect changes in relative scarcity are irrepressible. You can think of price movements in a market almost like a force of nature. It cannot be repressed. A great example of this comes from Chile in 1973. At the time, the Chilean government under Salvador Allende wanted sincerely to protect the poorest people from rising food prices. The rising prices all around in the economy, but particularly rising prices of food staples. And so they instituted price controls. Now, price controls are a common mistake of political leaders who don't understand market forces and the irrepressibility of market forces. So they introduced price controls in Chile in 1973 to try to arrest the constantly rising price of food staples. And there was a price control on bread. But other prices in the economy continued to rise. So the real price of bread ended up falling because all other prices continued to rise, including prices that reflected the cost of producing bread, the cost of electricity, the cost of the ingredients, the wheat and the yeast, cost of labor. Since the bakers could not legally raise their price, then they started to shrink the loaf, and the loaf would get smaller. And the price controlling government, observing this, therefore amended the price control legislation to try to control the size of a loaf. Well, costs continued to rise, and the bakers were not going to be providing bread at a loss. So then what constituted a loaf of bread really started to change. In order to be able to profitably produce a loaf of bread, the bakers stopped baking the bread and instead sold the raw dough to keep their costs below what they were forced to sell it for. So the idea was you bought an unbaked loaf of bread and you take it home and you bake it yourself. The point of this story is that the bakers, the market was finding a way to make sure that the price reflected conditions in the market. If the price cannot rise to reflect the conditions of scarcity in the market, then the quantity or the quality of what you get for the price is going to fall to restore the effective price. Price changes are irrepressible. Market forces cannot be corralled by legislation. So those are some of the subtleties. One of the ways that you can compare countries is by looking at the relative pay of those in the top echelon of the labor force and those at the bottom of the labor force. So what is top executive pay compared to those who are the office cleaners? That ratio is something we can compare from country to country. And it turns out that if we look at many countries, Jamaica is one of them, Nigeria is another one, the Philippines as well, and you compare those to that gap between executive pay and pay at the bottom in, say, the United States and Canada and United Kingdom, the gap is highest, is much higher in the first set of countries I called. Why is executive pay higher in some countries than in others relative to other levels of salary? Well, the price of executives, like all prices, reflects relative scarcity. In the United States, something like near to a third of the population cohort attends university. And for the most part, the executives are drawn from the pool of people who have university degrees. That gives them the platform to start climbing the executive ladder. So that pool is abundant in countries where going to university is widespread. In Jamaica and Nigeria and the Philippines and many other countries, only a tiny fraction of each population cohort goes to university. In Jamaica, it's less than 5%. In Nigeria, it's less than 5%. So therefore, the pool of persons from which to draw and train and develop into top executives is much smaller. So the competition for top executives is more fierce. And therefore, the high price of executives reflects that scarcity. It's not that Jamaicans are, Nigerians and Filipinos are more greedy than Americans and Canadians. Prices reflect relative scarcity. So we conclude that prices are the economy's automatic signaling mechanism. They signal relative scarcity, and as they reflect relative scarcity, they rise and fall. And in doing so, they stimulate or discourage the consumption of the item and the availability of the item to close that scarcity gap.